The investigators, the airline lawyers, the TV reporters, they all asked me the same question. What did you see? I'll tell you what I saw. I saw a crack appear in the wall of the plane like a spiderweb on glass. And then I saw the sky, not through the window, through the wall of the plane, an entire section of the fuselage, 3 rows of seats with people still strapped into them, just vanished into the open air at 35,000 feet. They were there 1 second, and the next, there was just a blue, screaming void. They want to call me a survivor, a miracle, but I know the truth. It wasn't a miracle that saved me. It was 2 inches of aluminum alloy and the simple, brutal physics of which side of the rupture you were on. My side stayed attached. Theirs didn't. Before I take you back to that exact moment, I need to know my voice is reaching you. Tell me, what city are you listening to this from right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. If you want to, know what it feels like to be at the center of the impossible and live to tell the tale. Stay with me. And subscribe. You won't hear this anywhere else. The investigators, the airline lawyers, the TV reporters, they all asked me the same question. What did you see? I'll tell you what I saw. I saw a crack appear in the wall of the plane like a spiderweb on glass. And then I saw the sky. Not through the window, through the wall of the plane. An entire section of the fuselage, 3 rows of seats with people still strapped into them, just vanished into the open air at 35,000 feet. They were there 1 second, and the next, there was just a blue, screaming void. They want to call me a survivor, a miracle, but I know the truth. It wasn't a miracle that saved me. It was 2 inches of aluminum alloy and the simple, brutal physics of which side of the rupture you were on. My side stayed attached. Theirs didn't. Before I take you back to that exact moment, I need to know my voice is reaching you. Tell me, what city are you listening to this from right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. If you want to know what it feels like to be at the center of the impossible and live to tell the tale, stay with me and subscribe. You won't hear this anywhere else. It had all started so perfectly, so boringly normal. That's the part that haunts me the most. The sheer, unapologetic banality of the hours before my life was torn in two. The flight from Chicago to Seattle was just a commute for me, a necessary gap between a completed bridge inspection and my own front door. I'm a structural engineer. I spend my life calculating stress loads, tensile strengths, and failure points. To me, an airplane wasn't a magical metal bird. It was a pressurized tube held together by rivets and equations, a system I understood and, in my own analytical way, trusted completely. I had my usual seat, 32A, a window seat near the back, far from the engines, far from the frantic energy of boarding. It was my quiet corner of the sky. I remember the trivial details with a clarity that feels like a curse. The slight stickiness on the tray table that I wiped away with a napkin. The synthetic clean smell of the cabin air. The low, reassuring hum of the engines spooling up for takeoff. A sound that, until that day, meant safety. It meant I was on my way home. The woman in 32B was a grandmother flying to see her first grandchild. She showed me a picture on her phone, a tiny, red-faced thing wrapped in a yellow blanket. We exchanged a polite, meaningless conversation about the joys of family and the inconvenience of air travel. Her name was Eleanor. Her hands were wrinkled, and she smelled faintly of cinnamon. I wonder if her family ever got the knitted sweater she had tucked into her carry-on bag. I remember the flight attendant's safety demonstration. I'd seen it hundreds of times. The practiced motions of buckling a seatbelt. The serene, pantomime of putting on an oxygen mask. I never paid attention. None of us did. We were all lost in our own worlds, insulated by the assumption of a safe arrival. We were a collection of strangers bound by a shared destination, all blissfully unaware that our mundane journey was about to become a global headline. Once we reached cruising altitude, the familiar calm settled over the cabin. The seatbelt sign pinged off. Laptops opened. Headphones went on. I pulled out a technical journal, intending to read an article on resonant frequencies in steel structures. The irony is almost laughable now. There I was, reading about how things break, while the very thing carrying me through the sky was preparing to do just that in the most spectacular way imaginable. Outside my window, the world was a masterpiece of serene blue and white. A carpet of clouds stretched to the horizon, so solid it looked like you could step out and walk on it. The sun was brilliant, a pure, unfiltered light that filled the cabin. There was no hint of a storm, no turbulence, nothing to suggest the violence that was brewing in the metal skin of the aircraft just a few feet from my head. For an engineer who understood the immense forces at play, the effortless way the plane cut through the thin air was a constant, quiet marvel. It was a perfect flight, and perfect things are often the most fragile. The calm lasted for another hour, an hour of blessed, ignorant peace. I had put my journal away, the article unread, and was just staring out the window, lost in the geography of the clouds. It's strange, the things you remember. I was thinking about the coffee I would make when I got home, the specific grind of the beans, the weight of my favorite mug in my hand. It was the last normal thought I would have for a very long time. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud at first. It was a pop, a single, sharp, metallic pop. It was a sound completely alien to the controlled symphony of flight. It wasn't the clatter of a service cart or the click of an overhead bin. It was high-pitched, clean, and violent, like a tightly wound spring snapping. It came from somewhere ahead of me, toward the middle of the plane. A few people looked up, a ripple of curiosity passing through the cabin. A baby started to cry. Eleanor, next to me, just adjusted her reading glasses, dismissing it. But I couldn't dismiss it. My entire body went rigid. In my profession, I've heard sounds like that before. It's the sound of metal giving way. It's the noise a steel beam makes milliseconds before it fails under stress. It's the sound of something breaking that should never, ever break. My blood ran cold. My hands gripped the armrests, my knuckles turning white. My engineer's mind, a thing I had always relied on for comfort and logic, was now screaming a single, primal word: wrong. A second later, the pop was followed by a vibration. This wasn't turbulence. I've been in severe turbulence over the Atlantic, the kind that drops you 50 feet at a time and makes your stomach leap into your throat. This was nothing like that. This was a sickening high-frequency shudder that seemed to be tearing its way through the very bones of the aircraft. It wasn't moving up and down. It was twisting. I could feel the floor beneath my feet vibrating, a deep, grinding tremor that suggested two massive pieces of metal were being scraped against each other with unimaginable force. The low hum of the engines was now drowned out by a deafening metallic shriek. It was the sound of a giant tearing a sheet of aluminum in half. Panic, a cold and greasy thing, began to seep into the cabin. The nervous smiles vanished. People were grabbing for the seat in front of them, their eyes wide and searching. I saw a flight attendant stumble in the aisle, her professional composure shattering into raw fear as she looked towards the front of the plane. She knew. Whatever this was, it wasn't in the manual. My gaze was locked on the fuselage wall just beyond my window. I was trying to rationalize, to diagnose. Had we hit something? Was it an engine failure? No, the sound was wrong. This was structural. The thought was so terrifying I could barely form it. The entire frame of the airplane, the very thing keeping the crushing vacuum of the atmosphere at bay, was failing. The vibrations intensified, becoming violent jolts. Small cracks like lightning bolts started to appear in the plastic paneling. Around the windows a few rows ahead, Eleanor let out a small gasp beside me. She had her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed on those cracks. The picture of her grandchild was still glowing on the phone in her lap. The plane gave a violent lurch, a sideways twist so powerful it slammed my head against the window. The grinding sound became a final cataclysmic roar of tearing metal. And that's when I saw it. The thing that my mind still refuses to believe. The thing that plays on a loop. In my nightmares, the crack I had seen in my mind's eye became real. It snaked its way up the wall of the cabin, splitting the fuselage open with a deafening bang. The cabin pressure didn't just drop. It evaporated in a violent explosive rush. An impenetrable fog instantly filled the air. The moisture sucked from our lungs and turned to vapor. The sound was no longer a shriek. It was a physical blow, a deafening explosion that ruptured my eardrums. Everything not bolted down was torn loose and sucked towards the growing hole in the side of our aluminum tube. Laptops, blankets, carry-on bags, people. The screaming was swallowed by the roar of the wind. My world wasn't falling. It was being ripped apart. My world ceased to have a floor or a ceiling. There was only the hurricane. The air in my lungs was stolen from my chest with a force so violent I felt my ribs would crack. It was a physical punch from the inside out, replaced instantly by a freezing, razor-thin wind that burned my throat and sinuses. The explosive decompression was an absolute sensory overload. The roar of 500-mile-per-hour wind, the shriek of twisting metal, the sudden paralyzing cold that felt like being plunged into Arctic water. My body was slammed back into my seat, pinned by the incredible force. My seatbelt wasn't just a safety device anymore. It was the only thing anchoring me to any kind of reality as the world dissolved into a blur of motion and violence. I saw Eleanor, the grandmother from Guam, seat 32B, torn away. Not forward, but sideways. Her hands reached for something, anything, but there was only the void. She was there, and then she was gone, swallowed by the gray and blue chaos outside the ruptured fuselage. Her phone, still glowing with the image of her grandchild, spun through the air like a discarded toy and vanished with her. My mind, the analytical engine that had defined my entire life, simply shut down. There were no calculations left to make, no stress loads to consider. This was not an engineering problem. This was the abyss. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. My brain was starved of oxygen. My vision narrowing to a dark tunnel. The last thing I clearly saw was the sky, but it was spinning, a nauseating vortex of blue and white. The sun flashed in and out of view like a strobe light at the end of the world. Then came the second lurch, a cataclysmic break. It wasn't a twist this time, but a clean, final snap. The section of the plane I was in, the entire tail, broke away from the main body of the aircraft. I felt it more than I saw it. A deep, resonant thump traveled through the floor, followed by a sudden, weightless lurch. We were no longer flying. We were falling. The main part of the plane, a tube of fire and smoke, plummeted towards the earth in a steep, horrifying dive. For a split second I watched it go, a wounded beast succumbing to gravity. But our section, my section, was behaving differently. It wasn't diving. It was tumbling. We were a leaf in a storm, a broken piece of a larger whole, spiraling downwards in a chaotic, terrifyingly slow descent. The aerodynamics were gone. We were just dead weight, a mangled chunk of metal, seats, and human beings, falling from the edge of space. The force of the spin was immense, pushing me into my seat, then pulling me against the straps. My head was thrown back against the headrest, then forward. Consciousness was a flickering candle in a gale-force wind. I remember flashes. The green and brown patchwork of the earth below, getting closer at an impossible speed. The sight of a wing section, sheared clean off, tumbling alongside us for a few moments before it was lost to the clouds. The impossible silence that would occasionally cut through the wind's roar whenever our piece of wreckage would orient itself just right. In those silent pockets, a new sound emerged. Not the sound of machinery, but of human terror. The raw, unfiltered screaming of the few, people still alive around me. A sound that will be etched into my memory until the day I die. It was the sound of people who knew they were falling, who could see the ground rushing up to meet them, who had been given the cruelest gift of all, a few final moments of lucidity to contemplate their own destruction. I blacked out. The lack of oxygen, the G-forces, the sheer psychological trauma of it all was too much for my brain to process. My last coherent thought wasn't of my family or my life, or any grand regret. It was a simple, detached engineering observation. This is not a survivable event. The structure has failed completely. Impact is inevitable. My consciousness blinked out of existence somewhere around 10,000 feet. The world of noise and wind and falling was replaced by a deep, dreamless, and utterly silent darkness. I was falling toward the earth at terminal velocity, strapped to a broken chair, completely and blissfully unaware of the final violent moments of the descent. The ground was coming. But for me, in that black void, there was nothing. No fear, no pain, just the quiet hum of oblivion. The first thing to return wasn't a thought, or a sight, or a sound. It was a feeling, the feeling of being cold, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from my very bones. The black void of unconsciousness began to recede, replaced by a gray, fuzzy twilight. My brain felt slow, like a machine trying to boot up with corrupted files. There was no memory at first, just a profound sense of dislocation. Where was I? The roaring was gone. The screaming was gone. The violent, world-ending chaos had been replaced by its opposite, silence. A silence so absolute, so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing on my eardrums. It was a cathedral silence, a forest silence. It was the sound of a world without people, without machines. It was the sound of the end. My eyelids fluttered open. They felt heavy, glued shut. The light was dim, filtered through a dense green canopy. I wasn't seeing the sky. I was seeing leaves. A million leaves, motionless in the still air. The world was sideways. Or maybe I was. My mind started to piece things together. Slowly, painfully. Flight, Chicago, the noise, the tearing metal, the fall. It all came rushing back in a dizzying, nauseating flood. I was alive. The simple, impossible fact was too enormous to comprehend. I tried to move, and that's when the pain hit. A white-hot, blinding agony shot up my left arm, a sickening crunch echoing deep within the bone. At the same time, I felt a warm, sticky wetness soaking through the fabric of my pants on my right leg. I grunted, the sound foreign and weak in the crushing quiet. I was still in my seat. The seatbelt, a simple strip of nylon webbing, was digging tightly into my hips. The only reason I hadn't been flung into oblivion. It had held. The engineering had held. I was strapped into seat 32A. But 32A was no longer inside an airplane. It was wedged violently between two enormous moss-covered branches of a pine tree. I was suspended, maybe 20-30 feet above the ground. The tail section, my tiny island of survival, had crashed not onto the earth, but into the forest canopy itself. The ancient trees, hundreds of feet tall, had acted as a colossal, brutal shock absorber, tearing the wreckage apart while simultaneously cushioning my final impact. I could see other pieces of the tail section tangled in the branches around me. A mangled piece of the galley. A section of the fuselage with 3 shattered windows. It was a surreal, horrifying treehouse built by a tornado. I forced myself to look down, my stomach churning with a mixture of vertigo and dread. The forest floor was a graveyard of progress. The ground was littered with the mundane artifacts of our former lives, now rendered meaningless. A single white sneaker, a copy of a romance novel, its pages fluttering in a slight breeze, a child's stuffed bear, its face half buried in the pine needles. A suitcase had been torn open, its contents, neatly folded shirts, a travel toothbrush, souvenirs from a city its owner would never leave, scattered like offerings to a silent, indifferent god. The violence of the scene was made worse by the tranquility of the setting. The forest was utterly peaceful, the sunlight dappling through the leaves, as if nothing had happened, as if a metal tube filled with 100 human lives hadn't just fallen out of the sky. There were no bodies, no other people, no movement, save for the gentle sway of the branches. The absence of life was a scream that echoed louder than the crash itself. I was the only thing here that didn't belong. A broken man in a broken chair, hanging in the trees, a ghost in the wreckage of his own tomb. The initial shock began to fade, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged terror. I had to get down. I had to find help. Were there others? Could anyone else have possibly survived this? My throat was raw, dry. I tried to call out, but the sound that escaped was a pathetic, hoarse croak. Hello? It was a whisper against the immensity of the wilderness. I took a ragged breath, ignoring the fire in my ribs, and tried again, forcing the air from my lungs. Is anyone there? The only sound was the echo of my own voice, a desperate, lonely cry swallowed by a silence so complete I knew in my gut that the real nightmare had only just begun. The echo of my voice died, and the silence that rushed back in was my answer. It was a cold, impartial judge delivering a verdict. You are alone. For a moment I just hung there, a marionette with severed strings, listening to the frantic pounding of my own heart. The adrenaline that had momentarily numbed me was now draining away like sand through a sieve, leaving behind the stark, unvarnished reality of the pain. My left arm was a disaster. It was bent at an angle that defied human anatomy. The bone clearly snapped below the elbow. A dull, sickening throb pulsed from it, sending waves of nausea through my body. Every tiny movement, every breath, sent a fresh jolt of white-hot static up to my shoulder. My leg was worse. A jagged piece of the seat's metal frame had torn through my thigh, a deep, gaping wound that was still weeping a dark, sluggish river of blood down my leg. Panic began to bubble in my chest, a cold, greasy feeling. It was the instinct to thrash, to scream, to surrender to the overwhelming agony and despair. But another part of me, the part that had spent a decade calculating breaking points and designing systems to prevent failure, took over. It was a cold, detached voice in the back of my skull. Assess, prioritize, execute. Priority 1, get out of this tree. I was exposed, vulnerable, and losing blood. Staying here was a death sentence. With my good right hand, I fumbled for the seatbelt buckle. My fingers were clumsy, stiff with cold and shock. The simple act of pressing the release button felt like trying to solve a complex puzzle. My broken arm shifted, and a raw animal groan escaped my lips as the fractured ends of the bone grated against each other. I bit my lip, tasting blood, and pushed again. The buckle clicked open. The sound was deafening in the silence, a gunshot marking the start of a race. The release of the belt was a mistake. My body, no longer secured, slumped forward. My entire weight was thrown onto my mangled arm, which was tangled in the wreckage. I screamed, a full-throated, ragged sound of pure agony this time. The world went gray, the edges of my vision swimming with black spots. Don't pass out. Not now, Hayes. I clung to consciousness with everything I had, my body trembling uncontrollably. I couldn't just drop. The fall would kill me or cripple me completely. I needed a way down. My eyes scanned the wreckage around me. The seatbelt, the thing that had saved my life once, might have to do it again. With painstaking slowness, using only my right hand and my teeth, I managed to unthread the nylon strap from the seat frame. It was about 6 feet long. Not much, but it was something. I looped one end around a solid piece of twisted metal above me, testing it with my full weight. It held. The descent was the most excruciating 20 feet of my life. I slid down the belt, my boots scrambling for purchase on the rough bark of the tree. Every inch was a battle against gravity and my own broken body. My left arm dangled uselessly, a dead weight of pure fire. The gash in my leg scraped against the trunk, tearing the wound wider and sending fresh waves of pain screaming through my nerves. I was grunting, gasping, my face slick with sweat and tears. But the cold, logical voice in my head kept repeating the mantra, control the fall, don't let go, survive the next second. When my feet finally touched the soft carpet of pine needles on the forest floor, my legs gave out instantly. I collapsed into a heap, shaking and hyperventilating, the world a dizzying green blur. I lay there for how long, I don't know, minutes or an eternity. But the voice wouldn't let me rest. The bleeding. Stop the bleeding. I pushed myself into a sitting position, leaning against the base of the massive tree that had been my perch. I tore a long strip from the bottom of my dress shirt. The fabric was thin, inadequate, but it was all I had. I wrapped it around the wound on my thigh, pulling it as tight as I could. The pressure was agonizing, but the dark flow of blood began to slow. Next, the arm. It needed to be immobilized. I scanned the debris field around me. My eyes landed on a piece of the interior cabin wall, a flat section of hard plastic and aluminum trim that had been ripped from its moorings. It was about 2 feet long. Perfect. I crawled towards it, dragging my useless leg, every movement an exercise in torture. I found a second strip of fabric, this one from a seat cushion that had been torn apart, and my own leather belt. Setting my own arm was an act of brutal self-reliance. I placed the plastic shard against the underside of my forearm and used my good hand to pull the fractured bone into a semblance of alignment. The sound of the bones shifting into place was a wet, sickening crunch that made me vomit. Bile burned my throat, but the sharp, grinding pain was replaced by a deep, throbbing ache. It was an improvement. I laid my broken arm against the splint, and using my teeth and right hand, I cinched my leather belt around the hole. Assembly, pulling it brutally tight. I had done it. I had stabilized my injuries. My body was a wreck, a failed structure of broken bones and torn muscle. But it was a structure that was, for now, holding. I leaned my head back against the tree, my chest heaving, and I finally allowed myself to look at the full scope of the devastation around me. and in the profound, terrible quiet of that beautiful, sun-dappled forest, the true weight of my survival crashed down upon me. They were all gone. I was a statistical impossibility, a rounding error in a final, fatal calculation of death. With my body crudely patched together, I was left with the silence and the pain. The pain was a living thing, a constant companion that whispered in my ear and sent jolts of electricity through my nerves with every beat of my heart. The silence, however, was worse. It was an absence, a vacuum where the sounds of 187 other lives should have been. I was the sole survivor of a ghost ship that had crashed into a sea of green. My engineer's mind, the one that craved order and predictability, was frantically trying to build a plan. Survival is a sequence of problems to be solved. Problem 1, immediate trauma. Solved, for a given value of solved. Problem 2, shelter. Problem 3, water. Problem 4, signal for rescue. A neat logical list. But my body wasn't a machine, and the forest wasn't a blueprint. The sun, which had seemed so indifferent before, was now beginning its descent. The golden light that filtered through the canopy began to shift, growing longer, redder. With the fading light came a new enemy. The cold. It started in my fingertips and toes, a creeping numbness that quickly spread. The damp ground leached the warmth from my body. My thin dress shirt, stained with blood and grime, offered no protection. The shivering started soon after, gentle tremors at first, then violent, uncontrollable convulsions that racked my entire frame and sent fresh agony through my broken arm. I knew I would not survive a night in the open. I needed cover. My eyes scanned the debris field, looking for anything that could serve as a shield. About 50 yards from my position, half buried in the undergrowth, was a large curved section of the fuselage. It was maybe 15 feet long, a silver whale beached in the wilderness. It was my only option. The journey to that piece of metal was a pilgrimage through hell. I couldn't walk. I couldn't even properly crawl. I moved by inches, dragging my shattered body through the dirt and pine needles, using my one good arm to pull myself forward. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. My broken arm, despite the crude splint, felt like it was on fire. My wounded leg left a dark trail in the soil behind me. The 50 yards might as well have been 50 miles. I was gasping, sobbing, the cold, logical voice in my head now just a faint whisper beneath the overwhelming roar of my own suffering. When I finally reached the fuselage section, I collapsed beneath its overhang, my chest heaving. It had formed a kind of lean-to against the slope of the ground. It wasn't much, but it was cover. It blocked the wind and shielded me from the vast, darkening sky. I huddled in the small space, pulling loose leaves and dirt over my legs in a pathetic attempt at insulation. My body one continuous violent shiver. And then the night came. In the city, darkness is never absolute. Here, it was total. A thick, suffocating blackness that swallowed everything. The forest, which had been peacefully indifferent in the daylight, transformed into a place of terrifying intimacy. It was alive, and it was loud. Every tiny sound was amplified 1,000 times. The rustle of leaves was a creature stalking me. The snap of a twig was a predator testing my defenses. The mournful hoot of an owl felt like a personal condemnation. My mind, starved of sensory input, began to create its own. I saw shapes in the shadows that weren't there, heard whispers in the wind that were just the blood pounding in my ears. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a pure, primal fear I had never known. I was no longer Ethan Hayes, structural engineer. I was just a wounded animal, bleeding and helpless in the dark, surrounded by a world that was ancient and utterly ambivalent to my existence. The pain, the cold, and the fear were joined by a new torment, thirst. My mouth was a desert. My tongue was a swollen, useless thing I would have killed for a single drop of water. Delirium began to lick at the edges of my consciousness, blurring the line between the real and the imagined. I must have drifted into a shallow, feverish state of half-sleep, but a sound jolted me back to full, heart-pounding awareness. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a small animal. It was the heavy, deliberate crack of a large branch breaking under weight. It was close, too close. My breath caught in my throat. I strained my ears, listening past the frantic drumming of my own heart. There it was again, A heavy shuffling sound in the undergrowth, moving parallel to my position. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. I lay frozen under the cold metal shell, my body a single rigid muscle of terror. The shuffling in the darkness was heavy, deliberate. It was not a deer. I could hear its breath, a low, guttural huffing sound that seemed to suck all the air from the forest. It was circling my makeshift shelter, sniffing the air. It smelled the blood. It smelled me. I held my breath, a silent, desperate prayer on my lips, convinced that this was it, that I had survived a fall from 35,000 feet only to be torn apart by a predator in the dark. A large, dark shape blotted out the faint starlight for a moment, and then, with a final, dismissive snort, it moved on. The heavy footsteps faded back into the cacophony of the night. I didn't move until the first pale fingers of dawn painted the eastern sky, a bruised gray-purple. I had survived the night, but the rising sun brought no warmth, only a stark, merciless clarity. My situation was no longer a chaotic nightmare. It was a simple, brutal equation. No water, no food, severe injuries. The variables all pointed to one inevitable result. The thirst was a living entity now. It had moved beyond a dry mouth and had become a physical ache deep in my cells. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent rhythm. My thoughts were sluggish, coated in a thick, syrupy fog. I knew, with the certainty of an engineer reading a fatal stress report, that if I did not find water today, I would not see a third sunrise. The logical part of my brain that had kept me alive so far was beginning to falter, but it gave me one last clear command. Water flows downhill. I was on a slope. I had to go down. Leaving the meager shelter of the fuselage felt like stepping off a cliff, but I had no choice. The crawl began again, a slow, agonizing pilgrimage to a destination I could only hope existed. Every foot was a victory paid for in agony. I pushed with my good leg, pulled with my good arm, dragging my broken body over roots and rocks. The splint on my arm scraped against the ground, sending lightning bolts of pain up to my shoulder. Time lost all meaning. There was only the sun moving across the sky, the pain, and the all-consuming fire of thirst. My mind began to play tricks on me. I would see shimmering pools of water just ahead, only to find they were tricks of the light on a bed of leaves. I heard voices whispering my name on the wind. It was Eleanor, the grandmother. It was the pilot. They were telling me to just lie down, to rest. It was a sound that saved me. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. The gentle, musical trickle of running water. The sound was a jolt of pure adrenaline to my system. I pushed myself forward with a renewed, desperate energy, ignoring the screams of protest from my body. I tumbled down a short, steep embankment, landing in a heap of soft mud and wet leaves. And there it was, a stream. Not a river, just a small, clear creek, no more than a foot wide, carving its way through the forest floor. I have never in my life seen anything more beautiful. I plunged my face into the icy water, drinking greedily, uncontrollably. It was the taste of life itself, cold and clean and pure. I drank until my stomach ached, until the fog in my brain began to clear. The water was a miracle. It was a reprieve. It had bought me more time. I lay by that stream for hours, letting the cold water wash over my hands, a temporary balm for the fire in my veins. But solving one problem only brought the next into sharper focus. Hunger. It had been a dull ache before, easily ignored. Now it was a hollow, gnawing void in my stomach. My body, replenished with water, was screaming for fuel. I had no energy. My muscles trembled with weakness. That's when I heard it. A new sound. One that didn't belong to the forest. It was a low, distant drone. An engine. My head snapped up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound grew louder, closer. A plane. A search plane. Hope, an emotion I thought had died, surged through me with the force of a tidal wave. They were looking for us. For me. It was high, a silver speck against the brilliant blue canvas of the sky. I scrambled for something, anything to signal them. My eyes landed on a piece of wreckage nearby, a shard of the fuselage that was still bright and reflective. I grabbed it, my hands shaking, and tried to angle it to catch the sun, to flash a signal. "Here! I'm down here!" I screamed, my voice a raw, broken thing. "Here!" I flashed the metal, over and over, a desperate, frantic plea. But the canopy was too thick. I was a tiny, insignificant speck under a vast, impenetrable blanket of green. The plane flew in a straight, unwavering line directly over me, and then it was gone. The drone of its engines faded, replaced once again by the indifferent sounds of the forest. And, with it, my hope died. It didn't just fade. It was extinguished, leaving behind an ash-bitter despair that was colder and more terrifying than the night had been. They hadn't seen me. They would never see me. The search grid would be marked as empty, and they would move on. I was alive, but I was already a ghost. I leaned my head back, the useless piece of metal falling from my numb fingers, and for the first time, I understood that I wasn't just fighting the elements. I was fighting my own insignificance in a world that had already written me off as dead. Despair is a quiet, patient predator. It doesn't roar, it whispers. And in the long, agonizing hours that followed the plane's disappearance, it told me my story was over. The world had moved on. My file was closed. I was no longer a person to be found, but a piece of wreckage to be recovered. The hunger was a dull, constant ache now, a cold hollowness that had consumed all other sensations except for the throbbing of my broken bones. I stopped trying to move. I lay by the stream, watching the water flow, my mind drifting in and out of a strange, placid state of surrender. I was a component in a failed system, waiting to be decommissioned by nature. I don't know if it was a day later or two. Time had become a meaningless loop of light and darkness. But in the middle of that gray, timeless haze, a new sound began to intrude. It wasn't the high, thin whine of a jet engine. This was a deeper, more rhythmic noise. Heavy, percussive whoomp 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 that seemed to beat in time with the pounding in my own skull. At first I was sure it was a hallucination, a deathbed dream cooked up by my starved and fevered brain. I didn't even bother to look up. Hope was a fool's game, and I was done playing. But the sound grew louder. It wasn't fading like the search plane had. It was getting closer, the rhythmic chopping of the air becoming a physical vibration I could feel in the ground, in my teeth. It was real. A helicopter. It was flying low, following the path of the creek, its shadow momentarily passing over me. Something flickered inside me. Not hope. It was too late for hope. It was a more primal instinct, the last dying ember of the will to live, fanned into a tiny flame by the roar of the engine. I knew I couldn't reach the piece of fuselage. I couldn't even sit up properly. My body was shutting down. I was out of options, out of strength, but my eyes fell on my right wrist. My watch, the one I checked 100 times a day. A simple steel diver's watch with a polished, reflective face. It was a gift from my father when I graduated college. A tool of precision, of calculated time. Now it was my last, desperate flare gun, summoning a reserve of energy I did not know I possessed. I began the agonizing process of raising my right arm. My muscles, atrophied and weak, screamed in protest. My entire body shook with the effort. It felt like I was lifting 1,000 pounds. I propped my elbow on a rock, my hand trembling violently, the watch face a jittery, dancing mirror. I had to aim it. I had to catch the sun and throw a beam of light into the sky. The helicopter was already past me, moving down the valley. My chance was vanishing with every second. Tears of frustration and pain streamed down my face. Come on, Hayes. One last calculation. I twisted my wrist, angling the face, searching for the sun. A brilliant, blinding flash of light shot off the crystal. I had it. I swept the beam back and forth across the sky, painting the green canopy with a desperate, silent message of light. Here. I am here. Look here. For an eternal, heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The helicopter continued on its course, its sound already beginning to recede. My arm collapsed, my strength completely gone. That was it. My last shot. And I had missed. The silence began to rush back in, ready to claim me for good. I closed my eyes, a final, shuddering breath escaping my lips. And then the sound changed. The steady, rhythmic chopping faltered. I forced my eyes open. The helicopter had stopped. It hovered for a moment, a dragonfly suspended in the air a half-mile away. And then, impossibly, it began to turn. It banked sharply, its nose swinging around until it was pointing directly back at me. It was coming back, The sob that escaped my throat was not one of sadness, but of a profound, shattering relief that was almost as painful as the injuries themselves. They had seen me. I wasn't a ghost. I was real. The helicopter grew from a speck to a deafening, wind-blasting machine directly overhead. The rotor wash was a physical blow, tearing at the leaves, whipping my hair across my face and blasting me with a hurricane of sound and fury. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I had ever witnessed. A figure appeared in the open doorway, a silhouette against the bright sky. A rope dropped, and a man in a bright orange jumpsuit began to descend. His feet touched the ground just a few yards from me. He moved with a calm, efficient urgency, his face a mask of professional focus. He knelt beside me, his eyes taking in my broken body, the crude splint, the blood-soaked clothes. He didn't say a word at first, just began checking my pulse, his touch firm and reassuring. It was the first human contact I had felt since I shook hands with the man whose seat I had taken on the flight from Chicago. As his partner lowered a rescue basket, the medic leaned in close, shouting over the incredible roar of the rotors. I braced myself for the words you see in movies, something like, "You're safe now," or "We've got you." But what he yelled into my ear was something else entirely, something that chilled me to my core despite the chaos. "My God," he said, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and horror. "The manifest said there were no survivors." That one sentence, "The manifest said there were no survivors," hit me harder than the fall itself. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit world I was about to enter, I wasn't a man who had been found. I was an error in the official report, a ghost who had refused to stay dead. The rescue basket was a cage of brutal efficiency, lifting me out of the green silence and into the deafening roar of a world I no longer recognized. The transition was jarring, violent. One moment, I was a part of the forest floor, a broken creature of dirt and pain. The next, I was ascending, watching the wreckage of my former life shrink into a tiny, insignificant scar on a vast, indifferent landscape. The world I had fought so hard to rejoin felt alien, and I, its newest citizen, was a refugee from the land of the dead. The hospital was a sensory assault. After days of near-total silence, the cacophony of beeping machines, rolling carts, and urgent, overlapping voices was a physical pain. The bright, sterile lights felt like an interrogation. Doctors and nurses moved around me, a whirlwind of blue scrubs and quiet. Efficiency. They spoke in a language of medical acronyms and clipped professional assessments. Multiple compound fractures, ulna and radius, severe laceration to the right quadriceps, hypothermia, dehydration, stage 2 malnutrition. I was no longer Ethan Hayes. I was a collection of symptoms, a fascinating case study in the improbable resilience of the human body. They cut away my shredded, blood-caked clothes, washing away the layers of dirt and grime that had become a second skin. As they cleaned me, it felt like they were stripping away the survivor, the animal who had clawed his way back to life, and leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve of a man who had no idea how to exist in this clean, orderly world. They pumped me full of fluids and morphine. The pain in my body began to recede, replaced by a warm, floating numbness. But the morphine couldn't touch the other pain, the one that was lodged deep behind my eyes, the one that saw a grandmother named Eleanor being ripped into a screaming blue void. When the immediate medical crisis was over, the next wave of invaders arrived. First came the NTSB investigators, 2 men in dark suits with tired, serious eyes. They sat by my bedside with a tape recorder, their questions polite but relentless. "Mr. Hayes, can you describe the sound you heard? Can you pinpoint the location of the initial rupture? Did you notice any unusual vibrations before the event?" I was no longer a patient. I was a witness. I was the human black box. I gave them my engineer's mind, describing the metallic pop, the twisting sensation, the final shearing roar. I gave them the data, but they couldn't possibly understand. They were asking about the failure of a machine. I was trying to describe the failure of the world. Then came the media. They were a pack of wolves, camped out in the hospital lobby, their cameras and microphones like weapons. My name was everywhere. Miracle survivor. The sole survivor of Flight 2880. I was a headline, a upbeat, sensational story of impossible luck. My face was on every screen, a picture of me from my company ID, a bland, smiling man who had ceased to exist the moment the fuselage cracked open. They wanted my story. They wanted the gory details, the terror, the moment-by-moment replay of the disaster. They wanted to sell my nightmare as entertainment, and the thought filled me with a cold, silent rage. But the hardest part, the true crucible of my trauma, came when a hospital psychologist, a kind woman, with gentle eyes, handed me a list. It was the passenger manifest. My name was at the bottom, with a line drawn through it. Above it were 186 other names, names of people who had been sitting just a few feet away from me, the flight crew who had smiled and served drinks, the businessman who was typing on his laptop, the young couple holding hands across the aisle, and Eleanor, who was going to meet her first grandchild. They were all just names on a page, but to me, they were ghosts, and their silent accusations filled the sterile hospital room. Why me? The question was a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. There was no logic to it, no equation that could explain it. My survival felt arbitrary, obscene. I had survived because of 2 inches of aluminum alloy, because my seat was here, and theirs was there. I was the statistical anomaly, the rounding error in death's final calculation. This wasn't a miracle. It was a cosmic joke. The guilt was a suffocating shroud. I had lived, and that felt like the cruelest, most unforgivable crime of all. The nightmares started that week. I would wake up screaming, thrashing against the clean white sheets, the roar of the wind in my ears, the feeling of falling, endlessly falling, back into the silent, waiting forest. The crash wasn't over. For me, it would never be over. It's been 6 months. The bones in my arm have been set, pinned, and have healed into something functional, though they ache with a dull, persistent memory when the air gets cold. The gash in my leg is now a puckered, angry scar that serves as a permanent reminder of my crawl through the forest. The physical structures have been repaired, but the other fractures, the ones deep inside my head, will never truly mend. I'm sitting on my back porch. It looks out over the Puget Sound, and on clear days like today, I can see the Olympic Mountains in the distance. I used to love this view. Now, I find myself watching the sky, not with admiration, but with a kind of obsessive clinical scrutiny. The sky is no longer just a color to me. It's a place with stress points and failure rates. I watch planes tracing their white lines across the blue, and I don't see progress or wonder. I see pressurized tubes, held together by rivets, flying through an environment that is actively trying to tear them apart. I don't design bridges anymore. I can't. My mind, once consumed with creating structures that connect 2 points of solid ground, can no longer find comfort in it. All I can think about is the point of failure, the one microscopic crack in a single metal joint that, under the right pressure and the right resonance, can bring the entire system crashing down. So now I spend my days doing something else. I spend my time studying how things break. I have every report from the NTSB investigation of Flight 2880. I have blueprints of the aircraft model, metallurgical analyses of the recovered fuselage sections, and maintenance logs going back 10 years. The official cause was listed as catastrophic structural failure due to metal fatigue, a simple, sterile explanation for an event of profound, unimaginable violence. They found the flaw, a tiny crack near a window frame that had grown with every single flight, a ticking time bomb hidden beneath a layer of paint. People, well-meaning people, still call me a miracle. They talk about divine intervention, about how I was saved for a purpose. They want to wrap my survival in a neat, comfortable story, but I know the truth. It wasn't a miracle that saved me. It was physics. It was the precise angle at which the tail section separated. It was the density of the old-growth forest canopy that cushioned the impact. It was the 2 inches of aluminum alloy that separated my seat, 32A, from the point of rupture. It was a lottery of random chance, and I just happened to hold the one single solitary winning ticket. The guilt of that is a shadow I will walk in for the rest of my life. I have the names of all 186 other passengers and crew members memorized. I say them to myself at night, in the dark, when the nightmares come. They are not just a list. They are the woman who showed me a picture of her grandchild, They are the pilot whose last terrified words were a desperate plea into a dead radio. They are the people who were sitting right next to me 1 second and were gone the next. They died because of a crack that no one saw. I survived. And survival is not an ending. It is a debt. It is a lifelong obligation. I am the human black box. The data recorders captured the final moments of the plane. I am the only one who captured the final moments of the people inside. My new purpose, the reason I get out of bed every morning and face that vast, terrifying sky, is to be their voice. I spend my days writing letters, speaking to aviation committees, and pushing for new, more rigorous methods of fuselage inspection. I use my engineering background not to build, but to protect, to ensure that the whisper of a tiny growing crack is never ignored again. I survived the crash, and I survived the wilderness. Now I have to survive the peace. I have to find a way to live in a world that keeps moving, a world where planes still take off and land every single second. I have to live with the knowledge that our entire existence is balanced on the knife's edge of structural integrity, and sometimes, for no reason at all, it fails. My story isn't about the luck of one man. It's about the 186 who weren't lucky. It's a story I have to tell for them. If you believe that stories of survival are more than just entertainment, that they are warnings, lessons, and memorials, then subscribe to this channel. Help me make sure that these voices, and others like them, are never lost to the silence.